Hey, this is a video for Evolution.2, so go ahead and set up a new entry in your Cornell notes. Remember to start a new page for this video. Today we will be discussing the vocabulary words variation, competition, and natural selection. So variation is simply differences within a population. So variation could refer to the differences in the beak size, could refer to differences in the actual size of the organism, could refer to slight differences in the color, also the size of the seeds. All of these show variation because they all have different DNA. Remember, only identical twins have exactly the same DNA. So different DNA is going to make different proteins. Now, competition is when organisms are fighting for limited resources, and one group is always going to be negatively affected. Most organisms want to avoid competition because when you have competition, someone loses. And if you notice here, when we separate these seeds, we have a lot of finches or birds are going to be competing for the small seeds. These 7 birds are competing for 4 seeds. Now it's obviously going to be this would be like an average. And then in this environment, we might have the larger ground finch doesn't have to compete because it has an abundance of larger seeds. So in this example, these smaller ground finches are going to be competing and the larger ground finches will not be competing. So natural selection, I'm going to use, natural selection is a concept, and I'm going to use giraffes to describe natural selection. So it's a process in which an organism survives and passes along favorable adaptations to the offspring. Favorable adaptations are going to appear more often. Now, I will describe this and I will use, there's a few different steps, so I would like you to also add these steps. So the first step is there's going to be natural variation within a population. So we might have giraffes with slightly different sized necks. You might have giraffes with different colorings. But if you notice here, this one's got a little bit longer neck. So what happens is not all the organisms are going to survive because they're going to be competing for the resources. If you notice, this giraffe can reach these leaves. These giraffes cannot reach the leaves. So these may be competing for any leaves that have fallen on the ground, but basically one giraffe, or the one that is out-competing the other ones, will be able to survive. And then those favorable traits will be passed along. So when this giraffe is able to consume enough food products, it's going to reproduce, pass its genes along to the next generation. And as these organisms grow up, the process starts over again. So you're going to see that there is natural variation. And then they're going to be trying to compete, and because some of them will outcompete, not all of the organisms will survive. So only those with favorable traits will be passed along. In this situation, the longer neck that can reach the higher leaves would be a favorable trait, and that gene or that trait is passed along to the next generation. And the process repeats itself again. There's going to be variation, and then they're going to grow up. And now this is going to happen over many, 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 many generations. And this is something that we don't typically see in a human lifetime, but it was seen, and there's a really good example that you might see again. And this is of the peppered moth. So back in the 1850s, before the Industrial Revolution, this was noticed in London. There were trees, and the peppered moths lived on these trees. And there were light-colored peppered moths and dark-colored peppered moths. And the light ones had better camouflage. So when these tree finches came around, they would pick off the black ones because they're easier to see. They wouldn't see the lighter tree finches, or the lighter peppered moths would camouflage better, and they would reproduce. So this trait was seen more often before the Industrial Revolution. But now, once the Industrial Revolution started happening, factories started producing smoke. And the soot and the smoke from all of the factories coated the trees and made the trees darker. So when you had the same types of variations within the peppered moth population, these tree finches would come by and they would start picking off the lighter colored peppered moths because they could easily see them. So the darker colored peppered moths had higher fitness in this environment, and they were able to survive and reproduce. So over time, when there was pollution, you would see more dark peppered moths because that was a favorable adaptation. They had higher levels of fitness. And when there was no air pollution, you would see lighter colored peppered moths because that was a favorable adaptation and they had a higher level of fitness. So these organisms try to avoid competition. And you'll see this in finch populations. There's actually a fancy term for it. This is occupying different niches. It's a form of resource partitioning. All of these terms you would see in an advanced science class, but you don't have to know it for living environment. But at its very basic level, these finches are going to occupy different spaces inside the tree. So you might have some finches hanging out where the flowers are. You might have some hanging out where the worms are found. You might see other ones in different parts of the trees. And then you're going to have different types of birds on the ground to pick up the seeds. So these birds are all avoiding competition. And another thing they can do is they could feed at different times, or they could actually just eat entirely different types of foods. Like different finches might prefer different types of seeds, different types of insects. That's another way of avoiding competition. Remember, competition is not a good thing because one organism will always fail. So I would like you to respond to this check for understanding. I want to know how well you understood this video. I thank you very much for your attention. I hope that this video was informative. I will see you soon.